At exactly 3 minutes past the hour, the long-standing royal silence was broken, not by pageantry or tradition, but by a confirmation so stark and so deliberately restrained that it sent immediate shock waves across Britain and far beyond its borders. This was not news of succession or scandal. It centered on a child. Prince Louis. And the fact that Prince William and Princess Catherine stepped forward together said everything before the words themselves were fully absorbed. Before we go any further into what this truly means for the royal family, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The message arrived softly, almost like a whisper, yet it carried the force of thunder. Buckingham Palace bypassed the usual grand press briefing and offered no advance notice. Instead, a single, unadorned notification appeared across official royal platforms. Fewer than 100 words long, the statement carried an almost unbearable weight. The timing, 3 minutes past the hour, was deliberate. Those who follow royal protocol know that when announcements deviate from tradition, something behind the scenes has gone terribly wrong. What shocked the public most was not only the message itself, but who delivered it. For the first time in recent memory, the palace allowed the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge to issue the statement personally. It did not come from a spokesperson or an official herald, but from two parents cutting through layers of royal formality to address the world directly. That decision alone was seismic. Their tone was calm, controlled, and unmistakably somber. There was no panic, but there was also no hope. Instead, there was a sense of heavy acceptance. Phrases such as deeply personal, grateful for understanding, and ongoing support painted a picture far bleaker than they could openly admit. The public, well versed in the monarchy's carefully coded language, read between every line. Something was seriously wrong with Prince Louis, and this was not merely a request for privacy. It was a plea. Within minutes, news anchors stumbled through their scripts. Veteran royal correspondents, hardened by decades of ceremonial announcements, appeared visibly shaken. Some admitted live on air that they had never witnessed anything like this. Social media erupted. Twitter surged, Telegram groups ignited, and the shock rippled far beyond the United Kingdom, reaching Europe, Australia, Canada, and the United States. This was more than breaking news. It was a fracture in the image of a flawlessly managed royal household. As the world tried to process the moment, comparisons surfaced. Seasoned commentators recalled the announcement of Princess Diana's death, the silence, the disbelief, the sudden absence of information. Others thought of the Queen's passing, when time itself seemed to stop. Yet this felt different. This was not the end of an era or the loss of a symbolic figure. This was about a boy, a child whose smile once brought charm and light to royal appearances, now reduced to a name in a devastating statement. What unsettled people most was not only the sadness, but the sense of finality. The language used was not typical of temporary setbacks or minor health scares. It felt conclusive. Irreversible. In that moment, Britain didn't simply hold its breath, it began to grieve. Not because it fully understood what had happened to Prince Louis, but because it feared it already did. While the public focused on what had been said, palace insiders understood that the true weight lay in what remained unsaid. Royal statements are meant to reassure, yet this one deeply unsettled. Every sentence felt burdened by omission. Analysts noted the careful pauses, the softened phrasing, and the complete lack of reassurance. This was not the language of optimism. It was the language of preparation. Almost immediately, experienced observers began asking the most chilling question of all: what were William and Catherine not yet able to say out loud? In the hours that followed, newsrooms didn't just report the statement, they dissected it. Attention was paid not only to the words, but to the delivery. The muted, mournful tone revealed more than the text itself. Familiar phrases of comfort were absent. There were no timelines, no assurances of a return to normality, no mention of a full recovery or positive response to treatment. Instead, the message lingered in emotional suspension, calm on the surface, deeply unsettling beneath. The phrasing bore the marks of long, painful deliberation. According to insiders, palace aides spent hours redrafting the statement, weighing every word and pausing between sentences, fully aware of the consequences each carried. This was not simply a press release. It was a careful attempt to prepare the public for something permanent. Notably absent were medical details, no doctors named, no diagnoses mentioned, not even the phrase health issue. The silence spoke volumes. It felt less like clarity and more like surrender to circumstances beyond control. Most striking of all was what was left out entirely. There was no indication of when Prince Louis might appear in public again. No reference to school, no suggestion of future engagements alongside his siblings. The lack of any forward-looking language made one thing clear: this was not a delay. It was a derailment. Behind closed doors, whispers grew that this situation had been unfolding far longer than anyone realized. Journalists revisited past footage of Prince Louis. Smiles once seen as playful now appeared strained. Moments dismissed as mischief took on darker meaning. Even the body language between William, Catherine, and Louis during previous public appearances was re-examined. Signs had been there, unnoticed at the time. Only now were they being understood. The public was not alone in its shock. Some palace staff reportedly learned the full extent of the situation only hours before the statement was released. Their reaction was not staged, it was raw and deeply personal. This was not just about a child in distress. It marked the collapse of a long-held illusion, that the youngest members of the royal family, protected by privilege and protocol, were somehow insulated from real human suffering. Perhaps most devastating was the growing realization that this was not temporary. This was not a pause in royal life. It was the quiet beginning of something permanent. Not an announcement of loss, but a preparation for it. The royal facade had fractured. Behind it stood two parents struggling to delay the exposure of a pain they could no longer hide. Then, defying centuries of royal instinct, Prince William did something wholly unexpected. He spoke not as an institution, but as a man. There was no podium, no script, no protective layer of formality. When he spoke again, it was not as a future king, but as a father unraveling in real time. His voice trembled. His composure faltered. And in that moment, one of the monarchy's most carefully preserved illusions finally collapsed. This was sorrow, fear, and powerlessness exposed for the entire world to see. The instant William appeared before the cameras, it was obvious that something was different. This was not a prepared address or a formal statement. It was a personal reckoning. The familiar image of calm control had vanished, replaced by a man visibly struggling to contain emotions that had been building for far too long. There were no polite greetings, no thanks to the media or the public. Instead, he opened with a single sentence: "I should have noticed sooner." Those words alone seemed to stop the nation in its tracks. With that admission, decades of royal detachment fell away. William spoke not from a position of authority, but from a place of regret. He described months of unspoken strain within the palace walls, explaining how Louis had slowly become quieter and more withdrawn, changes the family initially brushed aside as temporary. He acknowledged that the structure and demands of palace life had hidden what was really happening at home. Over time, the warning signs didn't become clearer, they became easier to ignore. Beneath his honesty lay a heavier truth, the overwhelming guilt he carried. William spoke of sleepless nights spent walking the corridors, questioning how he could stay so alert to national matters while failing to recognize the pain inside his own family. He recalled moments when Louis asked to avoid public appearances, when his laughter felt forced, when the brightness in his eyes faded into something empty. And yet, William admitted, he chose not to act because he couldn't bring himself to accept the reality. One memory, however, broke him completely. William stopped, steadied himself, and quietly repeated a question Louis had once asked. "Do I have to smile when I don't feel it?" The words cut deeper than any political scandal ever could. They weren't defiant. They were desperate. The plea of a child overwhelmed by expectations he couldn't articulate. William confessed that this was the moment he truly saw his son, and the realization nearly crushed him. He went on without restraint, revealing how deeply the situation had affected every part of their lives. His marriage, his sense of himself as a father, and the relationship between George, Charlotte, and Louis had all been altered. The family's balance had shifted. Catherine struggled to hold things together. George became noticeably more serious. And Charlotte began watching Louis closely, her concern mirroring her mother's quiet anxiety. Perhaps the most painful realization was that their efforts to protect Louis had actually pushed him further away. William stated it plainly, in trying to shield him from the world, we built walls we couldn't even see through ourselves. The words landed heavily. For the first time, the public witnessed what happens when royal responsibility clashes with parental instinct, and how the damage often remains hidden until it's nearly beyond repair. Yet while William spoke openly to the world, another child in the family was silently unraveling behind closed doors. Princess Charlotte was never meant to bear such a burden. But as Louis withdrew into himself, it was Charlotte who stepped into the emotional gap, absorbing fears she didn't understand and trying to soothe pain she had no power to fix. When her strength finally gave way, Catherine realized something heartbreaking: the suffering hadn't been limited to one child. It had quietly spread through the entire family. In the earliest stages of Louis' struggle, Charlotte appeared steady. She held his hand during public appearances, whispered reassurance when cameras turned away, and stayed closer to him than necessary. Many saw it as simple sibling closeness, but it went far deeper. Despite her young age, Charlotte had taken on a role no child should. Carrying Charlotte had taken on her brother's unspoken distress, becoming his voice, his constant presence, and, without anyone realizing it, his shield. Weeks later, long after William's public confession, the signs of Charlotte's emotional collapse finally surfaced. Catherine described a moment that shattered her, a quiet Sunday at home when Charlotte suddenly stopped speaking. It wasn't defiance or anger. It was exhaustion. Pure emotional fatigue. She folded into herself, her eyes distant and overwhelmed. When Catherine gently asked what was wrong, Charlotte answered in a whisper no parent ever forgets, I didn't want you to worry more. Those words cut deeper than any headline. They confirmed Catherine's deepest fear: the children were no longer just affected by the crisis, they were managing it. In trying to protect their parents, they had become victims of the same pain. The roles had reversed. The children were now shielding the adults. By then, Louis had nearly disappeared from his normal routines. He stopped talking about school friends. He no longer begged to stay up late. The laughter that once came so easily was gone. His spark was fading, slowly and painfully. Catherine watched as Charlotte tried day after day to reignite it, through games, songs, and quiet companionship, but nothing worked. And gradually, Charlotte herself began to slip away as well. Within the palace, where obligation often outweighs emotion, no one fully understood the damage silence was causing. There were no explosive arguments, no obvious breakdowns, just a slow suffocation of feeling. Charlotte's collapse became the clearest warning they had received, and it didn't arrive with tears or tantrums, but with stillness. That was when Catherine finally understood. They hadn't just missed Louis's pain, they had missed how it echoed through every room of their home. The belief that the situation was manageable, that it could be contained to one child, shattered completely. The suffering had spread quietly, pulling at the bonds between siblings, parents, and even the rigid structure of royal life itself. Silence had been the real enemy all along, and it could no longer continue. Then came the moment that confirmed everything had reached a breaking point. Prince Louis vanished from daily life. What should have been an ordinary morning passed without him. No school. No public appearances. No explanation. Behind closed doors, a decision had been made, one so serious it would permanently change his childhood. The monarchy had quietly withdrawn its youngest member from public view, for reasons far graver than anyone realized. The silence surrounding his absence was overwhelming. For a child whose small waves and mischievous smiles had endeared him to millions, his sudden disappearance wasn't just noticed, it was deeply felt. Parents at his school received hushed messages. Classmates were told he would be learning from home. And the media, unusually cautious, respected the silence, though not without growing suspicion. Something had changed, and whatever it was sent shockwaves through the House of Wales. Those close to the family would later point to a single moment, a seemingly ordinary incident at school that became the breaking point. The specifics were kept deliberately vague, but those aware of the situation described an emotional trigger so overwhelming that Louis simply shut down. It wasn't physical harm. It wasn't punishment. It was emotional impact. Something inside him fractured. And in that moment, Catherine understood with painful clarity that the world beyond their walls was no longer safe for her son, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The response was immediate. The family withdrew almost overnight, followed by urgent and private discussions. William and Catherine, who had long tried to raise their children with a sense of normalcy, were forced to accept a harsh truth: tradition could no longer shield their child. The constant expectation to appear, to smile, to perform the role of a flawless young royal had become toxic. And it had to end. What followed was unprecedented in modern royal history. A young prince was quietly removed from public life without illness, scandal, or a convenient explanation. There was no overseas trip, no seasonal retreat, no carefully crafted excuse, only silence. William and Catherine chose not to issue a formal announcement. There were no farewell photographs, no staged moments. Instead, they embraced something the monarchy rarely allows: silence as a form of protection. Privately, the decision took an enormous emotional toll. Louis didn't protest. He didn't question it. He simply accepted it, and that quiet surrender devastated Catherine. His compliance felt unnatural, almost mechanical. The lively child who once filled rooms with energy had become cautious, withdrawn, and distant. Specialists brought in discreetly warned that the damage could deepen if royal pressures continued behind closed doors, even without the public spotlight. What troubled William and Catherine most wasn't missing the warning signs earlier. It was the realization that their attempt at creating a balanced, normal upbringing may have failed because their version of normal was still rooted in duty, legacy, and expectation. They were forced to confront the possibility that the very identity Louis was born into might be what was breaking him. As the family turned inward, an unlikely protector stepped forward, someone who understood the cost of royal life better than most. While advisors stalled and protocols slowed everything down, Princess Anne acted without hesitation. There were no press briefings, no formal approvals, only instinct. She recognized the familiar pattern of pressure, silence, and emotional erosion and refused to let history repeat itself. What Anne offered Louis wasn't care wrapped in ceremony, but something far more radical within the monarchy: genuine normalcy. Inside the palace, everything had stalled. Officials argued about optics. Advisors agonized over phrasing. Strategists worried about precedent. Yet no one was asking the most important question: what would actually help the child? While others focused on managing appearances, and called William directly. Not as a royal authority or advisor, but as a sister who had witnessed the emotional cost of the crown and carried too many regrets of her own. That conversation shattered protocol. And didn't request permission, she gave instruction. She told him the boy needed to leave. Leave the palaces. Leave the routines. Leave the expectations that were slowly crushing his spirit. The answer wasn't public statements or endless meetings. It was simplicity, something the monarchy had long avoided. Under Anne's guidance, Louis was quietly relocated, not to a hospital or therapist's office, but to a place where titles held no value and responsibilities were real. His days were structured for purpose, not performance. Feeding animals, walking outdoors, completing simple tasks, not as discipline, but as grounding. And removed every expectation placed on him and replaced it with something the royal family had forgotten: freedom without an audience. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had lived through it. She had watched Diana's pain dismissed by tradition. She had seen Harry rebel, William withdraw, and a family fracture beneath appearances. Long ago, she promised herself that if she ever saw it happening again, she would intervene. With Louis, she kept that promise. Gradually, signs of life returned. He spoke more. Ate more comfortably. His distant gaze began to sharpen. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no cinematic moment, but there were small, meaningful shifts. He began asking questions again. He smiled, not for cameras, but for himself. And protected that progress fiercely. There were no photographs, no leaks. She demanded privacy, even as palace insiders grew uneasy with how far she had stepped outside her defined role. But to Anne, duty had never been about image, it was about responsibility. And her responsibility was the child, not the institution. Still, her actions unsettled the system. As Louis slowly rebuilt himself away from the machinery that had harmed him, murmurs began circulating within palace walls. Protecting the child had also exposed the system, and systems rarely tolerate exposure. Just as hope emerged, something darker surfaced. A confidential document exploded within the monarchy. Its tone was cold, calculated, and deeply unsettling. It didn't speak of healing or care. It spoke of optics, containment, and risk. When William read it, the truth hit hard. To certain figures within the institution, his son was no longer a child in need of protection, he was a liability to manage. The memo had never been meant for him. It was drafted in secrecy, shared among senior aides, stamped with strict confidentiality. But secrets inside palace walls rarely stay hidden. When it finally reached William, it felt like more than a breach, it was betrayal disguised as bureaucracy. The language was clinical, detached. Louis's name appeared not alongside concern or compassion, but under terms like reputational volatility, exposure, visibility, and containment strategy. It read like a corporate crisis report, not the story of a struggling child. There was no acknowledgement of his emotional suffering. No recognition of what he had endured. Instead, the focus was on deflecting public attention, reshaping narratives, and quietly erasing him from view. It wasn't a roadmap to healing, it was a strategy for disappearance. It began with a memo, a blueprint for erasure. William's reaction was immediate and explosive. For a man known for discipline and composure, the intensity of his fury stunned even those closest to him. He reportedly stormed out of the room, memo in hand, demanding to know who had authorized it. Staff recalled raised voices, William declaring that his son was not a headline to manage and that his family had already buried too many truths in silence. Catherine's response was no quieter, but where William's anger rattled walls, hers cut with surgical precision. She walked directly into the offices of senior advisors, placed the printed memo on the table, and, without a word, fixed them with a stare that allowed no defense. Then, calmly and firmly, she asked, "Would you speak this way if it were your child?" There was no answer. Princess Anne, upon learning of the memo, refused to let it slide. She had long been the steady center of emotional balance within the family, and now she saw what she had suspected for years: parts of the institution still prioritized legacy over life. And didn't merely voice outrage. She made calls, demanded accountability, and publicly stood by William and Catherine in what many described as the most unfiltered show of familial unity the modern monarchy had ever seen. Yet the damage was done. The memo was leaked to the press, and when excerpts were published, the backlash was instantaneous. Headlines condemned the palace's insensitivity. Mental health organizations issued scathing statements. Social media erupted with outrage, disbelief, and support for the Wales family. For the first time in decades, the royal institution found itself not defending a scandal, but contending with its own cold machinery. This was more than a PR disaster, it was a moral collapse. The public saw it clearly, an institution trying to silence a child to protect tradition. They did not anticipate the wave of fury that followed. With the veil lifted, the nation refused to look away. Trust shattered and outrage mounting, the palace had no choice but to do what it had long avoided. The illusion finally broke. In a statement unlike any before, the palace admitted the unthinkable: Prince Louis was receiving ongoing emotional recovery support. No euphemisms, no deflection, just the truth. Centuries of royal invulnerability collapsed in a single sentence, and the public response was overwhelming. The announcement was quiet, almost humble, but its impact was seismic. Buckingham Palace, long a fortress of stoicism, chose for the first time in modern memory to acknowledge vulnerability in a royal child without filters or spin. The words were simple and direct: Prince Louis was in recovery. He was receiving ongoing emotional care. And the family was asking not for privacy, but for understanding. It was a declaration of humanity, not hierarchy. The public's astonishment was not just about the message, it was about who shaped it. Catherine. Her influence was unmistakable. Within hours, a second, handwritten note appeared, deeply personal and profoundly maternal. She thanked the nation for its patience, acknowledged the burden of silence, and wrote simply, "Some truths are too delicate to share until they are ready to be held." In that moment, something shifted. The crowd outside the palace gates wasn't holding up camera phones anymore, they were holding their breath. The ripple effect was immediate and global. Messages poured in from across the world, parents, teachers, doctors, and anyone who had navigated the tightrope between silence and fear, isolation and recovery. Hashtags trended. Mental health organizations lauded the family's courage. Campaigns for child emotional awareness surged. Suddenly, Louis was more than a prince, he became a symbol, a reminder that even those born into unimaginable privilege are not immune to emotional pain. This moment also resurrected a legacy long buried within the monarchy, that of Diana. Media comparisons flooded in, not for scandal, but for empathy. Decades earlier, Diana had spoken openly about eating disorders, postpartum depression, and emotional neglect within royal walls. She had faced criticism and even punishment. Now her honesty was reframed as foresight. Louis's story, in many ways, continued where hers had left off, and this time, the institution did not silence it. It embraced it. The definition of royal strength began to change before the public's eyes. Not in speeches or ceremonies, but in truth, the kind that hurts and the kind that heals. Strength was no longer measured by poise, it was measured by the courage to say, "We're not okay, and we're doing something about it." For the first time in decades, the monarchy resembled a family, flawed, fractured, and trying. And yet, the moment that changed everything wasn't an official announcement. It was a photograph, Prince Louis beside his mother, hands in the soil, planting something new. No crowns, no distance, just healing. That image spread faster than any headline, silencing critics and transforming a narrative of tragedy into one of courage. There was no explanation, no official caption, the world understood instantly. This wasn't a PR maneuver. It was quiet strength. A child who had disappeared from public view wasn't being paraded back into the spotlight. He was being seen as he truly was, human, growing, healing. News anchors choked up on air. Social media turned reflective. Attention shifted away from titles to the boy at the center, a boy who had endured speculation and fear, now grounded in reality. No grand backdrops, no ornate suits, just soil, a small trowel, and a mother's hand guiding her son. Something profound happened. Public sentiment shifted. Worry gave way to empathy. Louis was no longer a mystery, he was a mirror, reflecting the struggles of every child under pressure, every family recognizing too late the signs of silence. His pain had not disappeared, but his strength was finally acknowledged. Without speaking publicly, Louis became a symbol, not of weakness, but resilience, the courage to break and keep trying. Mental health organizations hailed the image as transformative. Schools discussed it. Parents shared stories. Across Britain and beyond, families saw not royalty, but reality. The image also prompted a reckoning within the monarchy itself. Vulnerability, long treated as weakness, was now recognized as courage, a lesson passed from Diana to Catherine, now embodied by Louis. The crown, for once, was softened by truth rather than weighed down by perfection. And that quiet shift was unmistakable. It marked the beginning of a new era, a monarchy unafraid to speak in human terms, a royal family learning in public, a system leaning toward compassion instead of concealment. Louis's story, once whispered with dread, became a reason to believe change was possible. As the world watches this family move forward, one truth remains: this was not just tragic news about Prince Louis, it was a moment that forever transformed how the monarchy confronts pain, love, and humanity. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next.